So people in Northern Ireland are enjoying record pay increases. Are you feeling it in your pocket? And did you realise the Stormont regime is literally sitting on a gold mine? Meanwhile, rare earth metals have been China's winning hand in the tariff trade game that it's been playing with Trump. He has declared victory, but who has really won? And what's happened to that link between democracy and economic progress? Well, that's all in today's episode of Unpacked. Hello and welcome to Trading Up Unpacked. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
And this is the business podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY, where myself and the professor from Queen's Business School dig deep into the big business and economic issues of the day. And remember, you can get in touch at any time by emailing us at tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. Richard, I know this is what you get paid the big bucks for, so let's start with pay. And annual earnings in Northern Ireland grown by a record 8% in the last year, passing 31,000 for the first time. So are we all feeling better off? What's actually happening? What are the figures telling us?
Yes, indeed, Jim. So yes, it's the annual earnings posted their largest increase in at least 26 years, up 8.1%. That takes the median wage of earners amongst Northern Ireland employees, it doesn't include the self-employed, to above 31,000. And if you look at full-time wage, it rose above 37,000. And but the thing is, well, we've been seeing these kind of almost like record rises, and indeed the last 3 years has seen the largest rises in nominal earnings, which is before inflation, in 20 years. And in many ways, what employers have been doing is they've been responding to the significant increases in the national living wage. The likes of national living wage has gone up by almost 50% since 2019. And for 16 to 18-year-olds, it's almost doubled. So you're seeing those sort of increases feed through. But remember, nominal increases, you may think something like an 8.1% increase is really good, but inflation matters. And the good thing is that, yes, that is higher than the rate of inflation. So what you talk about is after inflation earnings or expressing earnings in real terms. So they've increased by 3.8% for full-time employees and 3.9% for full-time employees. And so even when you're taking account of inflation, we're seeing the biggest increases in annual earnings in a decade. Okay,
so that's kind of what people are getting into their pay packet. Taking inflation, it's still kind of better than inflation, so therefore people should feel better off. But I suppose you look back over the longer term, there was a lot of stagnation before that, so we're sort of maybe catching up again from where things might have got to anyway.
Yes, and we saw some of the after the pandemic, the COVID shock, we saw then the huge spike in inflation, and back then people weren't getting when UK inflation hit 11.1% year on year. People weren't getting pay rises in line with that. It was significantly less. So we have actually had. You've arguably got, if you look historically, this is both in the UK and Northern Ireland, we've had the worst run of over the longer term in real earnings that we've ever experienced, because normally it was always particularly over time that earnings would rise in real terms at a higher rate than inflation. But if we think back to what happened after the global financial crisis and the kind of austerity, the wage stagnation that was going on then. So what you really have to do is you really have to look at what are annual earnings now, adjusted for inflation, compared to what they were like, say, before COVID or even back to the financial crisis back in sort of 2008, 2009. And it's more enlightening then whenever you take those kind of looks. So if you take that sort of lens, so if you look at in terms of private sector earnings, so they're only up. Private sector earnings are up over 6 years. When you adjust for inflation, they're only up 2.9%. So
it's not, so not a huge jump there, really.
Not a huge jump. And then even when you look at 20-year change, so if we think back 2005, they're only up in real terms 8% after inflation, which is pretty poor. And then even if you go back to 26 years, so you're going back to just after Good Friday Agreement, you're going back to 1999, it's up 29% in real terms. But these are still very small rates of growth. If you look at the period from 2009 to 2019, the average annual growth for real earnings was minus 0.1%.
Gosh, right.
So that just highlights what the kind of that stagnation was about. And it took 12 years for real earnings to get back. So it was almost just at the start of the pandemic. Real earnings, we were recovering from that time of austerity and the whole cost of living crisis that everybody was feeling. Things were starting to improve, and then bam, we got hit with the pandemic, and then all the inflation there. And we're now just kind of recovering from that now. So the big increases that we're seeing over the last 1, 2, and even 3 years must be set in that context. But what is probably really more interesting is looking at the public sector. So they had a 13.3% increase in annual earnings in the 12 months to April 2025, taking the median salary to £36,490. So, and before public sector unions sort of jump down my throat and say, talk about that, what we've seen is there's been a lot of multi-year deals feeding in there. So that's even up to about 3 years of pay deals are now coming through. So yes, it's a big increase, but viewed over the longer term, it isn't. In real terms, the full-time public sector worker, median worker, saw a rise of 10.1% to £43,000 per year. That's about almost 10,000 above the private sector equivalent. And but it's whenever you look at the longer term and the kind of stagnation that the public sector pay has had over the longer term, if you look back to even over 20 years, because whenever you look at that 43,000 adjusted for inflation and you look back, that's at 2004 levels. Mm-hmm. So you've sort of had this kind of 20 years of stagnation. It hasn't been all kind of flat. It's been a bit of a roller coaster, but net, when you're comparing where the average public sector worker is today in April of 2025, they were pretty much no better off financially in terms of their pay than they were back in 2004.
And what does it tell us? And is it just a Northern Ireland thing then that we've got this disparity between public sector and private sector, or is it just particularly pronounced here?
Just in terms of the overall wages, the kind of public sector wage premium.
Yeah.
So you get that in both UK and in the UK region and UK regions, and in Northern Ireland it's kind of no different. But remember, it's what you're comparing within the public sector. You would have higher concentration of qualified sort of graduates. You've got doctors, you've got dentists, you've got a whole host of things. So it's more concentrated. So you're not necessarily comparing like for like, whereas the private sector then it has like a higher concentration of lower paid jobs as well. So the premium always then attracts attention and people going, oh, they're getting paid too much or things like that. But again, it's whenever you see what has been happening to the median public sector wage for a full-time worker over the last 20 years, you can understand now why there's the kind of discontent, the strike action, all the issues. And you maybe recall then when it was junior doctors talking about they wanted to get pay rises to make up for their lost earnings over the years of failing to keep up with inflation. And that's kind of what it is, what I'm sort of presenting here.
Yeah, so if you're seeing, so basically you hear the headline, biggest increase, but you're kind of missing the context, which is years of kind of stagnation of 0.1%?
Minus 0.1%.
Over a 10-year period or so?
Yeah, just about 11 years. Yeah.
And so, I mean, that is pretty grim. And I suppose the other thing to take away from all of this is, you know, sometimes we're going through quite big events, and we talk about the financial crisis or the Great Recession, as it was from 2008 and that period. And for a lot of people at the time who were experiencing it directly, it was people who maybe were exposed in the property market or things like that. But for others who weren't so directly affected, it probably seemed like this doesn't really affect me today. But actually, it was going to affect everybody, as we can see from these figures. When people, and I think it was Harold Wilson who famously said about the pound in your pocket. You know, the pound in their pocket was going to be less over the next decade or more because of what was happening in the financial markets, because of the crisis, because of bailing out the banks, because of all of that and what entailed from that. And so we had a decade or more of people really just not feeling any better off.
Yeah, and I suppose, and we'll touch on it later, in terms of that led to the disillusionment of people, households, in terms of, because it used to be, it was almost like poverty was really confined to people who were unemployed, who couldn't get a job, whereas what we've seen over the last 20 years has been the rise of, and particularly over the last decade, has been the rise of people in poverty who are actually in work. So securing employment doesn't necessarily keep you out of poverty, and it's because what has been happening with wages, that wage stagnation over a long period of time, and that has fueled discontent, the kind of grievance culture, not just in the UK, also in the US and in Europe as well, and that's kind of been reflected in our politics over the years as well.
Yeah. Actually, I wouldn't mind coming back to that later on, because I think there is an interesting report that you've highlighted about this connection between, I suppose, where democracy is in the world and a kind of very interesting measure of that. And I think it does connect with this whole economic story as well. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about kind of locally again.
I'll just throw in one more sort of like fact, because I know invariably we hear about people who's, you know, if there's talk of like income tax or tax the rich, and people often think, oh, that's not you or I, that's somebody else, that's the wealthy. What the figures did show is that to be in the top 10% of earners in Northern Ireland, if you're getting over 67,500, you were in the top 10%. And to make it into the top 5%, you're over 84,000. So those are what people will be interested in. But people, if they're on the kind of 67,000 in the top 10%, they're always sort of thinking that, oh, that should be the wealthy, the people in the six figures should be. But the reality is there aren't a lot of people there. And, you know, what Rachel Reeves will be sort of having to contend with, if you're actually going to have to increase tax, you have to increase it off a large base. Yeah. And it'll be a lot of people who are on 40,000, 50,000 and those sort of levels, as well as the six figures. Yeah.
It's all very well to say we want a tax for billionaires or millionaires, but there's such a small number of them, and also they tend to have ways of squirreling the money away or offshore or whatever, so it's sometimes harder to nail down. But yes, you may be forced, and actually it brings us on to, I suppose, a discussion of what Stormont's going to do in this kind of tough financial environment. But just before we get into that, I suppose, because you've mentioned the budget, interesting that there is increasing speculation now that she could perhaps go for income tax. Yeah. And I mean, I was writing about this a couple of weeks ago, saying this is the tax that she needs to rise, but it's the one that she won't touch, because she's said she won't put up taxes on working people, whatever way that is defined. But I was also arguing that I'd spoken anecdotally, you know, in relation to her last budget, where putting up employers' national insurance contributions seems, and the figures now do suggest, seems to have been a real barrier to people hiring people. One employer told me that the cost to them was, and it's not a massive business, but the cost to them was 250,000 in extra payments to HMRC, and as a result, they weren't hiring about another 5 or 6 people at a junior level this year. So that's 6 jobs that disappeared because of what the tax implications of what Rachel Reeves did in just one small business. So therefore, if that isn't a tax on working people where you make an actual working person disappear, I'm really not sure what is. So it does make much more sense economically to tax people more on income tax. It's fairer, it's more progressive across the board. You can tweak it, you can do the basic rate as well as the top rate if you want. But it will mean, I suppose, a more clear-cut breach of their pre-election promises.
But although I increasingly think that breaking the manifesto pledge is the least worst option, because if you recall back, it was like last year, Rachel Reeves said this was a big hit, big tax grab. She wasn't going to come back again. This was a one and done kind of thing. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. So she has to come back. And does she really want to then come back if she then is trying to fiddle around with the smaller tax measures that she's going? Like there are areas where she's going to probably then hit the self-employed more, try and change the differential where those on employees are paying more tax, relatively speaking, than the self-employed. A variety of measures, talk of mansion tax, all those kind of things. But ultimately, if she doesn't want to be in the same position as she's in today by having to come back again, she wants to get an insurance policy to prevent that from happening. And the easiest way of doing that is going for a 1-2p, well, probably even like a 2 pence increase in income tax rates. What she might do, the kind of plot twist, is I wouldn't be surprised, because there's even then talk if she did the reduction in the national insurance contributions, employers, whether she does a change and reduces that and tries to, because Reeves is the kind of patron saint of U-turns over the land in terms of winter fuel payments, whether it's the welfare cuts, whether it's all of these kind of things. She has done a U-turn, and whether it's more palatable to do that and it's in conjunction with increasing the income tax.
Yes, well, definitely it does make for more interesting speculation at the moment, so we'll have to wait and see, and we'll be picking through all of the details on that when, of course, the budget is unveiled at the end of this month. So thinking about then Stormont's kind of position in this context, it has received what initially was thought to be quite a generous settlement in the last sort of spending round, but it still isn't enough to cover what it needs to do, and it hasn't made the tough choices perhaps that would allow it to spend the money maybe more targeted and more selectively. But the question posed at the start there was, what if Stormont was sitting on a gold mine? And turns out it is actually sitting on a gold mine, sitting on the planning permission of a gold mine that apparently has more than $20 billion worth of minerals within it. And this, of course, is the big mine in County Tyrone in the Sperrins. And there's been a lot of opposition to it. But the problem for the company that wants to develop it is they've spent $250 million hoping for a decision within a couple of years, and they've now been waiting 8. And what's interesting is it's such a kind of an example of delay and dither and inaction from Stormont that it's made the headlines in The Economist, no less. And the headline in The Economist was, "The gold of County Tyrone shows Britain's barriers to development." Now, we could quibble with Britain, say UK's barriers to develop, Northern Ireland's barriers to development. And presumably the UK government doesn't want to be tarred with this particular brush either. But it does seem to be purely down to Stormont's inaction. And if they were to give the go-ahead for that, yes, of course, there'd be local opposition, but there would be a way, wouldn't there, of generating some revenue for the regime here in Northern Ireland, not just for the Treasury, if they negotiated correctly on that.
Yeah, because it's the mining is devolved to Stormont, so it would be up for whether there's creative thinking of how you could look at developing that, and whether you have some sort of gold tax. And I note that in China there, just over the last couple of days, they've had like a 6% VAT tax being applied to people purchasing gold.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Given the gold sort of rise as well. So it's like, obviously it's what their Chinese authorities are doing potentially for another revenue stream for them. And in The Economist, I did notice the kind of line that they were saying is the authorities in Northern Ireland. It was the level of incompetence was. I think it was level of incompetence was only matched by the level of indecisiveness, which isn't the kind of image that we want to be given out to the kind of investors and businesses who would be reading The Economist magazine. And but yeah, it then sort of touches on the abilities or the inability of Northern Ireland to develop things, notwithstanding environmental issues and how they're taken into account, because we've also had the likes of the interconnector, the North-South interconnector, for energy in terms of linking the two markets, and that's now going on like 20 years.
Yeah. No, it's kind of incredible.
The kind of lawyers versus engineers that we talked about, the kind of China and US in previous podcasts, and the ability to get things done or inability to get things done, and that continues to be a major problem.
Hi, listen, I'm just interrupting for a quick minute to thank you for being part of the Trading Up community. It's really appreciated. I think we're building a real community of business and entrepreneurship learning. So remember to hit follow or subscribe. It makes a big difference. And please drop me an email on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. While I have you, just a quick word about our sponsors, EY. EY is a global leader in assurance, tax, consulting, strategy and transactions, helping clients solve their toughest challenges and seize their biggest opportunities. With teams in 150 countries, EY combines global insight with deep local knowledge to help organisations transform and grow with confidence. Thanks again, and now back to the podcast. Yeah, I mean, I was doing a conference for Phoenix Energy recently. So a lot of people from the energy sector, not just gas, but electricity and others. And obviously one of the big things that they're looking at the moment is biomethane and using anaerobic digesters on farms to capture the gas, and then they can actually pump it into the gas network, and it can be burned the same as the natural gas that we get at the moment. And the problem is that there are no proper incentives at the moment to actually make this happen at scale. But it could do a number of things: provide energy security, it would provide income for farmers. The byproduct of it would be fertilizer that could be managed. It would reduce the kind of aerosol effect that we're seeing, which is impacting on the water quality and Loch Ness and so on. So there's all these kind of potential benefits in it, but it seems like nobody's really taken a joined up view on this to get something done. And coming back to the gold mine here. So here, I mean, some of the quotes in this are interesting. So Dalradian, the company, says the deposits it has identified make it one of the world's highest grade undeveloped gold reserves. Beneath the boggy earth, there's a geologist's sign fixed to the tunnel that it contains 234 grams of gold per ton of rock. So what does that mean? Well, apparently 1 cubic metre of rock could yield anything up to $100,000 worth of gold. And Adrian Boyce, a geochemist from Glasgow University, says it's far and away the biggest gold deposit ever found in the UK. And of course, gold has, quadrupled in value, I think, since the time when Dalradian arrived at the site. I know it's gone down a little bit, hasn't it? A bit of a drop in the last few days, but I mean, it's kind of really up there in terms of historic highs at the moment.
Yeah, I'm still well above Gordon Brown prices.
Oh yeah, Gordon Brown, yeah, famously sold the gold at the low. Yeah, not one of his finest moves. He was, let's give him credit for giving independence to the Bank of England. Let's just remember he also sold the gold at knocked down prices. So yeah, I mean, it's just, does it suggest that the devolution on these sorts of issues isn't really working? I mean, it's kind of somewhat embarrassing, isn't it, when these things make the pages of The Economist, and in a world where global investment goes wherever it can, and it sees Northern Ireland, it's kind of like a sign saying not open for investment, if this is the kind of way foreign investment is treated. Let's face it, they maybe could have made a decision that the mine shouldn't have gone ahead, but if they'd made that decision within 2 years, these guys wouldn't have wasted so much money.
Yeah, because they were waiting for 2 years, that's what they anticipated, because then it's just like, you just think of Dalradian, if there's, potentially if there's more rare earth deposits or something found in, or rare earth metals or gold or precious metals or anything else found on the island of Ireland, it sends out a bad message that we're not open for business.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you mentioned rare earth metals. I don't really know. Well, I've gone and checked and pulled up a list here of what rare earth metals are, because we want to come into that now in a minute. But actually,
not rare is the first one, the first thing.
Very important. But the hoard in Tyrone, apparently, according to the Economist here, it's mostly gold and silver, but also antimony, bismuth, cobalt, copper, and tellurium. So those sound pretty, I don't know if those are rare, but those are pretty interesting.
Like cocktails or something.
Yeah. But the rare earth metals, we've been talking about them, I think, wider afield than people would previously have done in recent months, because this has been the key thing that China has used in its battle with Donald Trump over tariffs. And it's Trump again, who always famously talked about somebody holding all the cards. Well, the big Trump card, it seems, that China had, not Trump, was rare earth metals. They have control over so much of the supply globally. They slapped import or export bans on them. And as a result, when Trump met President Xi there recently, they've declared a truce in the potential tariff war between China and the US. And so China's about the only kind of country that stood up to the US, and it's kind of, has it won? Although Trump declared that he'd won.
Yeah, well, Trump gave himself, marks out of 10, he gave himself a 12 for that deal, but that's... It certainly wouldn't have given him a 12. But in many ways, given the way things are going at the minute, and again, the Economist magazine's been detailing this, is that China has had and seems to continue to have the upper hand in the trade war so far, because essentially even the rare earth metals, which the Chinese were then saying they were going to withhold that, it's going to be for a year. Mm-hmm. So whereas Trump has done what they call the taco trade, the taco Trump always chickens out, where with the semiconductors, where he's going to release more of them, I'm not sure, to China, which he was restricting exports of those. Then it's also in terms of he's got the Chinese to then buy soybeans. That's what the US, huge exports of soybeans, is for feed for particularly pigs, and the size of one of the things which has been happening in China as it's developed over time and huge population is, as income increases and the country becomes more wealthy, they then increase their content of meat in the diet, particularly pork. So Trump did have a kind of a card that he was playing in terms of a choke point, was that the soybeans that China doesn't have enough. It was reliant on the US, but it had, because Trump had played that card a number of times previously in his first term in office, that China's diversified into other providers. Argentina, interestingly, is one of the ones which Trump has been getting close to and helping sort of prop up the Argentinian peso and stuff recently. So I think Trump's kind of moving in to try and curry favour there. So he's trying to play a game there. But yes, Trump, when you look at how his kind of negotiating ploys have gone so far, he's still in a worse position than they were before this trade war started, because China, with the rare earths, it's going to do this for a year. I think if you were then doing a criticism of China, I suppose one of the things is they've now kind of revealed their hand. On the one hand, they now know what Trump's weakness is, and they can play that all the time. But for looking at Europe and the rest of Asia, when they're sort of now looking at China and going, oh, right, that's what they're prepared to do, and they're prepared to get engaged with that, that's maybe going to provide a bit of a wake-up call, almost in the way that you saw the European countries with the Trump going to pull out of NATO and wanted the EU to pay for the military's spending for the Ukraine and protect themselves. You know, in a similar ways as the rest of the world is kind of watching as well and is going like kind of, is this the way the game's going to be played, and we've all got to chase after rare earths and develop them. And the thing about rare earths, and I suppose it comes back to the kind of Northern Ireland gold mine sort of issue, they're rare earths. They're not scarce. They're scattered all over the world. Australia, US, Canada, China has a lot of them. But China is the one which is prepared to, it's the refining of them, because they're very dirty, very messy, very toxic. And China's been able to do this. I suppose in a lot of countries, they would fall foul of environmental issues, and there's a lot of they produce a lot of toxic substances. So, but it's interesting that China, this is something that China has been developing, this kind of trump card, as it were, over decades. And it was Deng Xiaoping back in 1992. He famously said that the Middle East may have its oil, but China has its rare earths. And in many ways, it's been since then that was seen to be, these could become critical, and they have, as China has done with economic development, it plans for the long term, and this is something which has been decades in the sort of
1992. Making. That's pretty impressive going back that far. But yeah, it's kind of, and so what you're saying, yeah, and I saw Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, saying that China had overplayed its hand by, basically putting the gun on the table with the rare earths rather than just maybe threatening it. But, is it easy then for other countries to, as you say, they might know where there are deposits, but if you can't even mine the gold in Tyrone, are you going to be able to mine these much more toxic things elsewhere? Well,
it's going to be a slow burn, and that's something that they're not going to be able to turn around quickly. And I've noticed in the last few weeks there's been Australia and the US are doing some deal in terms of rare earths and some mines, and Canada's looking into that in more detail. But one of the reasons why the kind of Western world, as it were, didn't get involved in rare earths was also because it was not profitable. So it has to be subsidized. So it's coming back to this idea of strategic economic decisions, or the kind of economic nationalism, in the same way as there was a reaction after COVID from the pandemic where there wasn't enough access for PPE and masks and all those kind of things. That kind of provided a wake-up call to the Western world that we're reliant on supply chains elsewhere, so we need to bring some of that back. And rare earths is just another example of this, that but they are going to bump up against environmental concerns, as we've seen with the gold mine in here in Northern Ireland. They're going to bump up against that in presumably Canada, the US, and that's something which China hasn't had to deal with. It's been able to get those things run through.
Yeah, I mean, it's whether it's mining them in China itself or doing deals elsewhere, such as Africa, and bringing the minerals back.
But I think it's now going to have to be in the same way as defence expenditure is viewed. It's almost like it's become something where the public sector and governments are going to have to fund that, because it's seen as a strategic resource, which hitherto now they kind of just relied on. They let China build up this massive leverage and negotiating hand, which they just hadn't thought through.
Yeah, and I suppose then maybe we're going to see that word security attached to so many more things. So we mentioned energy security. We might have rare earth security, food security. In an insecure world, the idea of having greater control within your own country or an alliance of countries that share your values is presumably going to become much more important. So interesting to see.
And that's kind of what I think Trump's doing with Argentina. Has a lot of mineral resources, and why he's kind of like buddying up there with the chainsaw guy from
Malay,
from
who actually did better in the elections than was predicted. So just to divert into Argentina for a minute. So yeah, he's the guy with the mad hair and the chainsaw. I think it's kind of pretty much as many of us would know about him.
George Osborne didn't have one of those for the cutting.
No, he
public
played
spending.
it a little bit more cool. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe as effectively. Who knows? And in fact, some we're giving Milei, regardless of his kind of wild style, shall we say, some credit for a certain kind of achieving a certain fiscal discipline in Argentina. But what happened was he had a bad there was some sort of bad by-election or something, which spooked the markets, and they thought he's going to be out of power, or at least hamstrung. These economic reforms won't continue. And then the peso, there was a run on the peso and so on. So things stabilised a bit after the election now. And of course the Americans were...
Scott $20 billion.
Yes, the Americans were rowing in to back the peso, yeah.
Yep.
So they weren't, they're willing to sort of spend more abroad than at home, it seems, to back others. This is the new form of American aid, is it?
Yeah, because it's almost, well, what they've sort of referred to it as, it used to be what was referred to as back in the early 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine, about keeping, where it was like the Americans didn't want European colonization to come back in, they wanted to keep them away, and it's been now dubbed the Donroe doctrine, where Trump is now looking increasingly at his backyard, because we've aware of like Panama Canal, where he talked about buying that back. He talked about Canada being the 51st state. He's got his eyes on Greenland, and then in terms of Venezuela as well, where he sees there's a authoritarian dictatorship in Nicolas Maduro there that he wants to kind of overthrow because of the election or the fact that there was an election, and the person who won that election hasn't got in. So Donald's doing the kind of decent thing and overseeing that, although he's talking about being after curbing the drugs and curbing...
Yeah, what has kind of spooked a lot of people legally are these the kind of essentially bombing boats that he says are drug boats, and even if they were, there's some dispute as to whether or not it's legal what they're up to there. But yeah, so quite extreme measures in Venezuela. But
it's almost like back to the 1980s, and that idea of like the kind of Cold War, and keeping an eye on whenever it was like the CIA were involved in Central America and Nicaragua and all those sort of countries. It's almost like Donald Trump's having more of an interest now in his backyard, and whether that's just to play. He wants to have the Western Hemisphere, both North and South and Central America, and whether he lets China then have Asia, and then it's up to Europe to just negotiate with Vladimir Putin or something.
Find its own way in between. Well, talking of authoritarianism, that is kind of this interesting summary and report that is from the V-Dem Institute, which looks at a democracy report every year, and the latest one is 25 years of autocratization, and basically what the report does, and it seems to be they use a lot of in-depth kind of indices to measure things, but essentially when you look at the headlines, they're looking at the state of democracy in the world in 2024, so it's just looking back last year, and basically the level of democracy for the average world citizen is back to 1985. And by country averages back to 1996. So we're back to 1985 levels when we're looking at it at a country level, and democracy is losing out the most in terms of economic power. It is at its lowest level in over 50 years. In a truly global wave of autocratization, Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia are in particularly steep decline. There's various stats here we can jump into, but I think the headline theme is, and this is maybe coming back to some of the stuff we're talking earlier on about wage stagnation, some of the other things we've seen since the financial crisis, the Great Recession, Brexit, maybe the election of populist leaders like Donald Trump. We're seeing this used to be a kind of consensus that there was a link between democracy and economic progress. In order to have sustained economic development, you needed to adopt not just the kind of Western market models, but also the idea of Western democracy, because it was that system that ensured, I suppose, the creativity, the diversity, the kind of freedom that allowed for an equivalent freedom economically, and therefore the two went hand in hand. But this report is telling us that democracy's in decline, and if we look around the world, countries that aren't particularly democratic aren't necessarily doing badly economically. I mean, we're talking about China.
Yep.
So it's that link's gone, it seems.
Yep. So it was like, all through the Cold War, it was a challenge of ideologies between liberal democracy, Western capitalism, and communism. And then it was like the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. Then you had the breakup of the Soviet Union, sort of 1991, and it was then seen at the time, that was the end, and famous kind of philosopher and author Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history and the last man, and it was going to be the triumph of liberal democracy, that all other forms of government had been exhausted and kind of shown to have failed, and it was then going to be communist countries such as the Soviet Union and Russia, etc., were then going to embrace capitalism, then ultimately embrace democracy. And indeed, that was seen to be what was hoped for. It was maybe a bit of a naive hope for, even in the likes of China. Get them into the World Trade Organization, bring them in, get them into the global economy, and how that can then sort of, that will be one way of kind of continuing with this kind of liberal democracy and Western capitalism, and that was the end state of which everybody agreed to. But it's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah,
since then, in terms of people having that view, whenever you think, and I suppose you then even see then what has happened, sort of with Russia, then also then the whole global financial crisis, and how that was maybe seen to be people becoming a lot of disenchanted with even capitalism, and you had all the kind of anti-globalization kind of marches and demonstrations and things like that. And then I suppose it was the aftermath of that global financial crisis, then in the likes of UK, austerity, the bailing out of the banks, all the problems with that, and that kind of ran up to for Brexit as well, where there was a lot of people just a kind of grievance culture, hard done by, things aren't working for them, fed up with globalization. They're seeing, say, inward migration, a lot of immigration coming in, but their standard of living isn't improving, and essentially you've seen that happen in the US, and it's almost whenever you look at that, then you look at the election of Trump, also in terms of Brexit, they don't look like kind of outliers. Whenever I was surprised when I saw the kind of updated this reports for 2024 of just how much you have seen this just wave. They're talking about the third wave of autocratization.
Mm-hmm.
And back in 2004, the majority of the world's population were living in democracies.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas fast forward 20 years, now it's almost almost three quarters are living in an autocracy.
Yeah. It's the highest since 1978.
And so it was almost assumed, and whether that was seen to be, again, a kind of naive kind of view where it was, yes, there'll be democracy and everybody's going to then follow our kind of way of life and culture and views and things like that. And it certainly hasn't worked out that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at some of the other metrics there, comparing those 20 years between, say, 2004 and 2024. Number of countries democratizing, 26 countries in 2004, 19 in 2024. So fewer countries heading the democratic path. Things like number of countries autocratizing, as in heading towards autocracy. Well, in 2004, 12 countries measured in that category. In 2024, it's 45. It's amazing, a huge jump. Freedom of expression deteriorating. That was happening in 7 countries in 2004. It's now happening in 44 countries. And things like quality of elections improving. That was 30 countries in 2004. In 2024, 10 countries. So it's a pretty damning report, I suppose, pointing out, really a quite dire state of democracy. So it means that if we consider ourselves to live in a liberal democracy, we're now in the minority, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what they actually then highlight as well is then, remember this was taken 2024, and so it was kind of pre-Trump. And what the report actually does raise a concern of is the decrease or the democratic decline in the US as a risk factor, because you've got like Trump challenging institutions, challenging norms, all of that sort of thing. So if you sort of think the direction of travel of this isn't something that we're expecting 2025, 26, 27, that it's going to start going the other way and going back towards democracy. It's still, the trajectory is still going democratic decline and the rise of autocracy. And in many ways, this kind of context maybe provides some context as why Trump is perceived to be doing what he's doing, because he views the world has changed and he needs to be more of a authoritarian figure in a kind of in a autocratic world, and the kind of people he seems to admire most are like Putin, Xi Jinping, Erdogan of Turkey, those kind of people as well.
Yeah.
So
no, and I remember it sort of struck me, it was before the election. I was sitting beside a wealthy American at a big kind of charity dinner thing, and we weren't really talking directly about politics, but he kind of dropped into the conversation that it was time for a strong leader, and that was how he put it. And I think that term, was kind of being accepted and put around by a lot of people of that type, perhaps very wealthy, wanting certain sort of changes in government, but they were willing to compromise. Effectively what they're saying, even if they're not spelling it out, is we're willing to compromise on that democracy bit in order to get the strong leadership that we want on these other issues. And, so I think that's maybe where even with everything else that's been happening, and there are elections coming up in the States.
Yeah, and it's even in Europe where you see like in terms of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and then there's even like Serbia, and then we have then even in the UK where it's then you've got Reform Party and stuff like that. So there's a lot of political kind of change is going on at the minute, and that's only going to continue as far as we can see.
Populism is popular. And I suppose just we like to talk about the big issues on this podcast. But so we were starting off really talking about wages. We are seeing some increasing real terms increases in wages, but after such a long period of stagnation, and we can see that stagnation, economics and politics are intrinsically linked, and therefore if people are feeling poorer, they will start to feel disaffected from the political system and start to look for other answers. And that's maybe why we've seen some of these things happening in the Western world. But then the other thing that we've mentioned, again locally, say a lack of a decision on a gold mine, but it's maybe emblematic of other big infrastructure projects. You mentioned the interconnector, many other things where government, democratically elected government, doesn't seem to be able to do things. It doesn't even be able to seem to make decisions. And again, this feeds into this idea that democracy isn't really working for me if I'm the person in the street. And therefore, perhaps no surprise then that, Western democracies are under threat because democracy isn't being seen to deliver for people economically.
Yeah, it's because essentially it's saying how do you then get back to good government, good outcomes, delivering for the people, and at the minute that seems as far away for people here in Northern Ireland, UK, as it ever has been.
Well, that's a cheery note in which to end, isn't it? We promised to come back with something a bit more upbeat next week. But it's one to peruse and think about. At no point in gilding the lily there. The figures on democratic decline are pretty stark.
You wouldn't be able to get the gold to gild that lily.
No, indeed. Nobody's digging it out of the hill in Tyrone for me at this stage. But listen, thanks a million, Richard, for joining us on Trading Up Unpacked again today. You can join us again next time from all of us here. See you next time. Thank you.